So I was thinking back on this conversation that I was having with a patient one day who kept complaining about she didn't understand why she was getting sick so often and all these illnesses started popping up even though she had been doing everything, quote unquote. She kept complaining like, "Doc, I don't understand. I eat all the right foods, I exercise, I take all the pills, and I still am getting sick." So I sat her down, and I think at this point she was open because it was after this conversation that she started to make headway. And what I explained to her was something that I want to explain to you guys, and it may be very pertinent for a lot of you that really struggle with your health and you're in that same situation where you feel like, I've been doing everything and nothing seems to move the needle. And the conversation that I had with her went like this. I told her, essentially you have two brains, right? You have two brains. One part of your brain wants to grow, thrive, build, be basically healthy. The other one only wants to stay safe. It wants to attach itself to things that are familiar. It wants to be small. And the one that wins out of those two is the one that's older, the one that's faster. And it's basically invisible. So today, I'm going to talk about this whole issue in this podcast, and I'm going to break down the science and the strategy of these two brains and the strategy that I helped her to break out of that. So we're going to be discussing the Paleo cortex and the Neocortex, and basically how this silent battle inside of you is influencing your health, it's influencing your relationships, your money, and whether or not the things that you desire becomes reality. So I basically gave her a lesson that I learned back in, I think it was chiropractic school, where we talked about this in, I think it was our neuroscience class. We may have talked about this in another class, but I do remember talking about this in our neuroscience class where our professor was basically telling us about these two brains, and he started with the paleocortex. And he said that the paleocortex is basically the ancient survival brain, or what they call like the reptilian brain. And the thought process was that this is evolutionarily older. They say 300 plus million years. Don't quote me on that. That's just what we were told. And it has basically three different layers. And all mammals have it, all reptiles have it. Now, the interesting thing about this, and this is what I work on with almost every single patient, is that this is heavily tied into the limbic system, especially the different portions that control emotions, control like your sense of smell, and other parts of your brain that controls the unconscious processes that's happening in your body, right? So it's processing smell, emotion, memory, instincts. Any of the unconscious pattern recognition, things that like you just do instinctively, what you call instinctively. It's nonverbal, non-rational, it's very fast, right? This is the stuff that you are reacting to when you say that you're in a state of fight or flight or freeze. You have these emotional things that happen. This is all happening in the paleocortex. Now, there's another part of your brain called the neocortex. This is what we call more of the rational thinking part of your brain. This is the executive portion of your brain. This is what kind of delineates the rest of the animals and humans. This is what we think about. And from an evolutionary standpoint, this is a little more newer. It has 6 different layers. The one that we focus on a lot is what's called the prefrontal cortex. This is the one that is involved in planning, language, abstract thinking, imagination. This is the part that allows you to do things like set goals, imagine like the future, solve problems, control impulses, all of that kind of stuff. That happens in your neocortex. Now, the neocortex is very slow. It's deliberate, and it consumes a lot of energy. And your brain and your heart are two of the most energy-consuming organs in your body. And this is the reason why when you are driven more by your paleocortex, the fight or flight, you need way more glucose to function. And this is a lot of times why people have brain fog or don't seem to be able to make the decisions that they want to make, or they know they want to do something, yet they go and make the decision, or they try to make the decision, I should say, and they just can't follow through with it. And I see this with a lot of patients where they're so excited to get started on the things that I laid out for them, right? I lay out this whole picture. Here's what we're going to do, X, Y, Z, step A, B, C, D, E. They get all excited about that. And then all of a sudden, when it comes time to make a decision, what happens is the paleocortex overrides the neocortex, and they go back into what seems familiar. And this is the whole reason why people get stuck. This is the reason why you may be stuck in whatever is happening in your life. So I want to explain a little bit about that whole process of why we get stuck. And I want you to understand, and I explain this to patients a lot, where we discuss what's called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And you can go ahead and look that up. And we talk about this a lot because people, they have dreams, goals, and aspirations, whether it would be in their health, wealth, relationships. They have all of these things, yet what happens is the bottom part of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is never fulfilled, which is basically safety. And this is where your paleocortex functions, is that of safety, familiarity. Anything that goes out of that or is not considered to be safe or reminds the body of something that is traumatic, this will keep or basically shut down that decision-making process of your neocortex. So this is basically like when, the neocortex is saying, yes, let's build this healthy regimen. Everything I see here looks great. Build wealth. I see the path forward. Let's break all of these cycles. And then the paleocortex, that's what we call like the little devil on your other shoulder. It says, but stress and struggle are what we know. They feel familiar. They feel safe. That's the paleocortex talking to you, right? This is when you try to adopt like a clean diet. Hey, I'm going to go on this January 1st, right? Hey, I'm going to go on this diet. But then by January 15th, the stress of going through all of that, the unfamiliarity is the stressor that drives you to binge at night. Why? Because the paleocortex is associating sugar, carbohydrates, binging, all of that kind of stuff with comfort and safety. That's basically what's happening, right? Maybe some of you have seen things where you get an opportunity to get a better job, or you have something where you need to step out of your comfort zone, right? Everybody hears that. You need to step out of your comfort zone to be in a new dream or a new goal. And then what happens is you kind of procrastinate, or you just dilly-dally in really taking a step forward, or you just don't take a step forward. And the reason why is that the paleocortex associates that stepping out of the comfort zone, stepping into that new life as a threat. And it all goes back to childhood programming. I don't know if you've seen that movie Inside Out by Pixar. If you haven't, go and watch it. It demonstrates this idea so perfectly on how these traumatic events, and it may not have to be really threatening events to be traumatic for your body. These events formed our worldview, right? Whatever happened in our childhood, that basically formed our worldview. And that worldview is the lens through which we see things. So what happens is anything that reminds us of that, we see it through that lens. So if we see the opportunity to become healthy, we see it through a lens of something that may have happened early in our childhood that says, hey, I don't know if I want to do that because it's going to bring me discomfort and it's not going to be safe. Even though we know in our neocortex that it's going to help us, our primitive brain switches on and says no. And if you don't know how to override this, you are always, let me say that again, you are always subject to your paleocortex, no matter what. I had this patient that come in years ago where he had a diagnosis of lung cancer. And the obvious reason was that he was a longtime smoker. So we talked about everything and everybody else all excited to go. We got started. We put together his plan, got going. And a few minutes later, after his first treatment, he walks out of the office, and I was notified by my front office staff, and he was smoking outside. And it did surprise me, but I understood why. So the next time he came in, we discussed about the whole smoking thing. And I didn't reprimanded for that. I says, I understand why. But what I did was I gave him the tools that I'm going to give you guys at the end of this. I gave him the tools to override that. And what we found was that he had some type of trauma that had happened to him in his childhood, that every time he felt uncomfortable, he needed to smoke. And it really didn't have anything to do with what the cigarette was doing for him. It was how it was making him feel. And we had to help him basically to get over that. And there's a technique that I use called neuro-emotional technique. And this really gets into the portion of the into the portion of the paleocortex called the amygdala. This is basically where all of your emotions live, right? What happens is you have an emotional pattern that's remembered, or an emotional memory that's remembered, and it's tied to pain, because pain is basically our ultimate motivator, right? And that's why you see a lot of people, they're more motivated by the avoidance of pain than they are motivated by the potential gain that they could have. And I see this a lot with patients where people would come to my office, and then I would tell them, hey, here's what we're going to do to basically, you're not in a really dire state of need in your health, but here's what we're going to do to prevent any further things from happening. And then their paleocortex kicks in and they're like, no, I'm not going to do that. And then years later, something happens in their body where they do need assistance in their health. And they come in and say, hey, doc, now I'm ready. And I said, what was different then than it is now? And they said, I just got a diagnosis that it's basically very scary. And that's what they were motivated by, right? So it's basically the same issue that was happening where they knew that they could attain health, but they're motivated by avoiding disease. And it's two sides to the same coin, right? So here's some more examples that I was going through when I looked at like health. Whenever you go through stuff like chronic stress, you overactivate the paleocortex. And in turn, you have what's called cortisol dysregulation. And with that, you have immunosuppression. Your gut starts to go. You start to have all this fatigue. All of that is due to chronic stress. Now, the reason why people stay in chronic stress is because their paleocortex is firing over and over again, because there are things that reminds itself of a threat. So whenever I work with patients, I always tell them that healing requires what we call neocortical intent and autonomic recalibration. Basically, you have to consciously be intentional about what we put into place. And we have to recalibrate your brain, the unconscious part of your brain, because most people, they hit this wall, and they gave a term to it called the psychocybernetic mechanism, like a thermostat in your body, that anytime you make a change in your physiology, your brain looks at the body and says, that's not how it was supposed to be. So whether it would be health or disease, especially health, and I see this a lot with stuff like weight loss, that one's like really easy to see, is that the moment that you start getting favorable results, that thermostat kicks in and says, we got to go back to where we were. That's a better place to be. And that's all the autonomic system that needs to be recalibrated. And I see this with relationships. I see this with finances. And we need to break that cycle. So going back to that patient that I was talking to you about that had lung cancer and he was still smoking. This is basically the thing that I put into place for him. And the first thing that I told him is that we need to get his brain, both part of his brains, in alignment. And everybody thinks about chiropractic and alignment and the spine. And I always tell people the biggest alignment has to happen within your mindset, right? So your mindset and how your brain is functioning, that needs to be in alignment. So we need to, and when I say mindset, that's the conscious part. That's the neocortex. That needs to be in alignment with to inform and to instruct the subconscious mind, the paleocortex. And like I said at the start of this, you are subject to the paleocortex. So you can actually reprogram what the paleocortex is viewing as safety. Now, it takes a lot of time and repetition to do that, because you got to understand that it took a lot of time and repetition for it to get there. So this is what I told him. I said, basically, if you want to manifest change in your body, real sustainable change, you need to have both of these brains in alignment. So what I gave him is what I'm going to give you guys right now, what I call the 5 S's. So if you want to write this down, go ahead and write this down. If you're driving or if you're on the treadmill or doing whatever, don't worry, you can just come back to this later on and then you can write this down. But basically, these are the 5 S's. And this is a toolkit that you need to have in place in order to rewrite that autonomic response. First of all, what we're going to be doing with this is influencing the neocortex, the rational part of the brain, the conscious part. And then through the repetition of the conscious brain, we're going to influence the subconscious brain. And what really got me interested in all of this were 2 things. One, when I took the seminar course of neuro-emotional technique by Dr. Scott Walker, and also when I first read the book, Think and Grow Rich. And when I read that book, it really didn't talk about money in and of itself, like how you would hear like a Dave Ramsey talk about, right? All those things, the tactics. They were talking more from a strategic, more foundational thing of what's the psychology that surrounds becoming wealthy. And I looked at that and I overlaid that on neuro-emotional technique. And I said, this is the exact same thing for health. So what I started to do first in my own life, and then I started to extrapolate that with patients, were these 5 S's. And the first S is what we call scribing, or to write things down. This is when you start journaling, you start writing out your goals, you start scripting out things. This starts to create clarity. It starts to create specificity. And this is where we get that conscious intent, right? I talked about that a little earlier. Now, whenever you start to write things down, you start to gain clarity about stuff. And for some of you, you may not know what it is that you actually desire in your health picture. But what I tell patients, and this is what I told him, I says, why don't you start with the things that you don't want? And we're more accustomed to knowing what you don't want rather than what we do want, because we're more motivated by pain. So we started with, what are the things that he wanted to remove from his life from a health perspective? So he started writing down all the things that he didn't want. And then what I told him from that was, I want you to just do the opposite of whatever it is you don't want. So if you didn't want this, it means that you wanted the exact opposite of whatever it is. So just write that down. And then if you're not clear, I should say, then write down what you don't want, then just flip it around. And whatever is the opposite of that is pretty much what you do want. Because when you remove something, it'll be replaced. Always has to be replaced. And I'm going to do a whole other podcast about addictions, because the addictions rides along this. And I'm going to give you guys a whole thing about why addictions happen and why addictions don't ever go away, because it has a lot to do with what we're talking here, but it also there's a physiology behind that. So if we know what we don't want, it has to be replaced by the thing that we do want, but we may not know what that is. So it's the exact opposite. Number 2 is to see. So again, we're still in that neocortex part. And this is where I had him start to visualize what it is that he wants to happen in his body. I wanted him to visualize the things that first was going wrong, and then what it would look like to be right in his body. So you start to activate different portions of your brain. You start to activate the prefrontal cortex, the occipital lobe, because that's the part of your brain that codes for vision. And I wanted him to rehearse this every single day. So he wrote down what it is that he wanted. Then I had him sit and visualize. So scribe, see, and then the third part was the speaking part. And I had him write down these affirmations. And one big affirmation is, so let me back it up. The whole part with emotion, and when it's tied into all of this, is we want to reach a state of what's called emotional neutrality, where you're not overly emotional and you're not overly depressed. We want you just like a boat sailing on the ocean. We don't want you flying above the water. We don't want you sinking below the water. We just want you right on the water, smooth sailing. And this is where affirmations come into play. We create this emotional neutrality with this one affirmation that I had him do. And the affirmation went like this. It says, even though I'm experiencing, and for him it was lung cancer, so you can put, even though I'm experiencing XYZ disease or issue or whatever. I totally and completely love myself. And I had him say that over and over again. Even though I'm experiencing XYZ, I totally and completely love myself. Or you can add in, I totally and completely accept myself, right? That affirmation in and of itself was enough to start changing his physiological function within his brain. This repetition will start to build a different neurological pathway, or what we call neuroplasticity, and it creates what we call neural familiarity. Now, when we start to speak these emotions, I had him marry that with, when I had him start speaking these affirmations, I had him marry them with feeling to create an emotion. Because if you just say something and there's no feeling attached to it, there's no real neurological firing going on that's useful for change. So the words that you're speaking, the words that you're seeing needs to be attached to a feeling, right? And this is why people can remember things when it was a highly charged emotional event, because it created an emotional feeling. Like I can remember to this very day what was going on, the smells that was around me when 9/11 happened. I can tell you what was happening on the television as I turned it on. I can tell you the noise that the television made as I turned it on, because it was a highly charged emotional event that still lingers within my mind to this very day. So this is what you need to do to recondition these neurological pathways. You need to speak something, tie it with the feeling to create an emotional resonance within your body. Okay. So that was number 3. Number 4, I just talked about this, smell. I had him utilize different smells while he was doing these things to basically reprogram his subconscious mind. And the one thing that I used was rosemary oil. Actually, anything can work here, but I like rosemary because that stimulates the brain. It creates an emotional memory. You can use stuff like frankincense or lavender, but there's something about rosemary that anchors that emotion to the memory, and it starts creating that neuroplastic change deep within the Paleo cortex, right? Because smell directly activates the olfactory system, the sense of smell, which is tied directly to the Paleo cortex. Okay. And number 5 is state. Okay. This is your physiological state. So I had him do different movements and hold different postures while he was doing all of these things. Now, the thing about that is, if you look at animals in nature, they'll enact their physiology when they're underneath fight or flight. Now, we all know this as anxiety or panic attacks. Neurological system, if we never release an emotion, is trying to do that from a physiological perspective. So if you can create your state, you can actually influence and deprogram to reprogram your brain to what you're trying to accomplish rather than it just running amok by itself. Now, this practice of state, whether it would be movement, posture, this creates a sense of safety and a sense of power. And then with this, it'll anchor new beliefs into your nervous system. So a simple thing was, I needed him to figure out what posture made him feel like he could overcome something, whatever that posture was. For me, as a baseball player, I always had a ready posture right before, and when I was playing defense, right before the ball was hit, I had a ready posture. So for me, whenever I reprogram stuff, I get into that posture. And it's the same for me if I was hitting a baseball or whatever, assume that posture. You've seen other people recommend stuff like breath work, whether it was like Wim Hof or different types of breathing techniques. And this is the same thing. What you're doing is you're changing your physiological state to improve your neurological function at a deep paleocortex level. So let me recap these 5 steps. First step is to scribe, write things down. Second step is to see or visualize. Third step, speak affirmations. And you can write any affirmations that you want. The one that I have used and it works nonstop is, even though XYZ is happening, I totally and completely accept myself. And number 4 is using essential oils or imparting smell. And then the 5th one is your state, some type of movement or posture, and holding that state while you're doing these things. So I hope this was informative for you and you got something out of this, and you start to understand how much your brain and the different parts of your brain plays a role in your success in your health journey. And this may be the big obstacle that may be holding you back from achieving the health goals that you want. So I thank you guys for listening. And if you haven't been subscribed or following on the podcast, if you're listening to this on Spotify, please go and hit that follow button and then click the little bell so that you'll get notified when I put up these new episodes. If you're not yet following me on Instagram, go ahead and follow me on Instagram at tripleplaydoc. I post some crazy stuff on my feed every single week. People always message me about the crazy stuff that I post about, but it's there to, and the reason why I post that is because it's there to trigger the Paleo Cortex. I want to create that emotion in you. So here's the episode, and you guys can understand why I post a lot of things to create that basically scroll stopping thing, because basically when you're on social media, you're just scrolling, or what they call doom scrolling. And little do you know, you're programming your Paleo Cortex. And if you don't like what's happening in your life, that's the place that I would start, is stop doom scrolling and be more intentional about follow and the things that you let into your mind. So get off my soapbox for a little bit. So follow me on Instagram. I do weekly Q&A. And if you want more information, head on over to my Instagram account. I have a lot of stuff there. I have my newsletter that I send out every week. Go to tripleplayperformance.com. You can sign up for it there. But again, if you have questions, I'd love to hear your questions. You have comments, you can leave it in the comment section on Spotify. But this is Dr. Mike signing off till the next time, saying be well and aloha.